And joining us now on the debate in the nation's capital, Stéphane Dion, former Minister of the Environment and the MP for Saint-Laurent-Cartierville, and Claire Demers, Associate Director on Climate Change at the Pembina Institute. And joining us here in studio, Quentin Chiotti, Senior Director on Atmospheric Issues at Pollution Probe, and York University economist Peter Victor, who has worked on environmental issues for more than 30 years as an academic, consultant, and public servant. And as I welcome everybody to the broadcast tonight, I suspect, Monsieur Dion, I should give you the first crack here, because even though you didn't come up by name in the previous interview, you were referred to in the previous interview. So in the interests of fairness, I offer you the chance to respond to anything that our good friend George Monbiot had to say in that last interview. What do you say?
I would agree with him. I think we have a consensus.
That's the consensus is on what?
On the fact that climate change is man-made, according countless number of scientific organizations around the world, that as a legislator, I need to accept the principle of precaution, since most scientists are saying that this is a danger for humanity. We need to act. Canada is not doing enough. It's not because at the last election it did not go well that we should give up. So I think it's what he was saying, and I agree with that.
Okay, Quentin Chiotti, I wonder if you could pick up on one of the points George made in the interview, which was he wasn't that optimistic that a legally binding agreement to tackle climate change was going to come out of this get-together in Copenhagen. What do you say on that?
Well, I think it's positive that both China and the United States are planning to attend, and that they're certainly committed to some extent to be there and to see where it leads in the coming year. Having said that, I think it's important to recognize also, certainly here in Canada, in the absence of federal leadership, there's a lot happening, and that the leadership void is being filled provincially.
Filled provincially. Okay, Claire, what do you have to say on the possibility of getting a legally binding agreement to tackle climate change in Copenhagen?
Well, I think that's absolutely what we're looking for. We're looking for an agreement that's fair, ambitious, and binding, but there's certainly a recognition at this point in time that we won't get every I dotted and every T crossed before the end of the Copenhagen talks, but we can lay that foundation for the agreement that we absolutely need.
Peter Victor, how about you on that?
Well, I was struck by George's comment about the effort to lower our expectations. I find that is going on. I'm very disappointed about it, because I think these things are partly driven by expectations. If we expect a lot of our leaders, then they'll perform. If we are sort of pushed into expecting very little, then they will let us down.
Who is leading the charge to lower expectations?
Well, in this country, I think...
everywhere, not just here, but everywhere around the world. Who's doing it?
You read it in the media. Where they're getting their information from, I don't know, because I'm not personally directly involved in the negotiations. So I don't know how they're being briefed and what stories they're trying to put out. But it does seem to be that we are part of we're on the receiving end of a process designed to lower expectations, so they can walk away from the meetings without an agreement.
But Stéphane Dion, when you see that Barack Obama intends to attend now, doesn't that look like he's increasing the expectations given his presence there?
Yes, it created a new momentum. But I must say that the Danes are lowering expectations, the United Nations are lowering expectations, that the likelihood that we'll have a binding treaty in a couple of weeks from now is very unlikely. What we hope to have is a meaningful political agreement that will lead next year to a treaty.
In which case, Monsieur Dion, does the fact that we all seem to be saying here, or you all seem to be saying that Copenhagen is unlikely to get a binding multilateral agreement in place. We know that Kyoto did get such an agreement in place, but that many countries, either signed on and didn't do it, like Canada, or didn't sign on in the first place, like the United States. Does this prove that these kinds of agreements are a waste of time?
Not at all, Steve. First of all, Kyoto worked. Most Kyoto countries will reach their target. The EU 15 will. Japan is very likely to do it. The problem is that we didn't have enough Kyoto. If you look at the 5 larger emitters, China, United States, Russia, India, Japan. Only the 5th one of them, Japan, had a Kyoto target to decrease their emissions. The 4 others didn't, and they were 50% of the emissions. So what we hope to have, if it's not in the coming weeks, at least in the coming months, it's a binding treaty that will put every country in the obligation to do something to decrease emissions in order to reach what the science is asking us to do, to decrease our emissions by 50% for 2050.
Well, that's interesting because the conventional wisdom, I think, Quentin Chiodi, is that Kyoto was a failure. And Monsieur Dion is now saying, wait a sec, it's actually been a lot better than it's getting credit for. Where do you stand on it?
Well, it's only a failure insofar as when you look at the overall global emissions, we're considerably higher now than we were back in 1990. Having said that, I would certainly agree with Mr. Dion that a number of countries have met their targets. Having said that, the science is a lot stronger than it was even in 2007, which emphasizes the need to come up with an agreement in Copenhagen.
Claire, what's your view on whether or not these kinds of vast multilateral agreements, at the end of the day, actually achieve anything?
Oh, I think it's critical that we have a multilateral agreement. I mean, this is the ultimate global problem, and we need a global solution. And I think our perspective in Canada is entirely skewed. I mean, I think we need to remember that we are actually the only country to commit to a Kyoto target, ratify that, and then walk away from it. So this is not a treaty that's seen as a failure in, as Mrs. Dion mentioned, in other parts of the world. But it is certainly a treaty that was always only seen as the first step and one that needs to be built upon and strengthened. And that's what we're hoping to do in Copenhagen.
Well, let me follow up then with Peter Victor. You know, what's the primary obstacle? Okay, we're taking a second look at Kyoto tonight, or maybe a 20th look at Kyoto tonight. We're the only country that signed and didn't follow through. There are others that signed and did follow through. The U.S. didn't sign. What's the primary obstacle to reaching some kind of consensus in Copenhagen that would be meaningful right now?
You know, a lot of this has to do with the nature of the problem. Climate change is one of the hardest problems to solve precisely because no one country, really no two countries can solve it on their own. So there's a great incentive to sort of sit back and let somebody else go first. Unfortunately, we sat back further than most and let others go first. So that's really unfortunate. But it's the character of the problem, and we are still a world of nation states. So these nations go forward to these international agreements, and for most of them, perhaps all of them, what's uppermost in their minds is pursuing their own national self-interest. And yet this is a global problem that requires a different mindset. And I think that is in many ways the fundamental obstacle to solving the problem.
Stéphane Dion, follow up on that if you would, because many countries around the world love to see themselves portrayed as leaders on big issues. Why would it be that nobody wants to be seen as a leader on this one?
And as the professor just said, it's one of the most difficult public policy you may imagine, because there is no kind of reward for local action. If the glaciers in the prairies of Canada were disappearing because of the oil sand greenhouse gas emissions, I'm sure that Saskatchewan and Alberta would come with big targets of reduction. But it's only 1/10 of 1% of the problem of global warming, the tar sands. So you see, you have always this kind of free riding effect where each country is hoping that the others will do that job, and each country thinks that if it is acting alone, it will change nothing. And at the end of the day, we don't have the result we needed. So it's why we need this global treaty where you have obligation to come with a result, and you are taking into account of your greenhouse gas reductions in a global treaty. Because if each country does what they want without any responsibility for it, we'll never be able to make it.
Claire, let me do a follow-up with you on this, because I think I'm remembering correctly, more than 20 years ago or so, I think darn near every country in the world came to Montreal and eventually signed what they called the Montreal Protocol, which resulted in significant environmental positive change. The world agreed to kind of stop using CFCs that were affecting the ozone layer. Now, if they could do that 20 plus years ago, what's the problem today?
Well, I would absolutely say, you know, the Montreal Protocol was a successful one, and that's exactly what we're looking for now. We're looking for a binding agreement that has targets, that has financial support, so that poorer countries can move away from the sort of emissions pathway that we've followed. And I think that that's absolutely possible. So I don't see any need to write Copenhagen's obituary yet. We haven't had the conference yet. And as many people have mentioned, there's a lot of political momentum right now that is building with people like Barack Obama deciding to go, China, other countries. So I think this is absolutely still something where we're looking for that big success.
Peter Victor?
Well, I just wanted to add to that I think one of the reasons why the Montreal Protocol was a success was that there was a readily available technical solution to the problem. That's number one. Number two was that although the industry that was the focus of attention, the chemical industry, is really important, we weren't at that time, as we are now, looking at how we get energy. And when you start challenging the energy sources on which modern economies and developing economies depend, and you start saying, look, you know, folks, we may not be able to use so much of that kind of energy in the future as we've done in the past, then lots of interests come into play, lots of really deep concerns get registered. And so whilst we can learn from the Montreal Protocol, we can show that the world can reach effective multilateral environmental agreements, this is a tougher one.
Stéphane Dion, how useful is the Montreal Protocol as a template for what they're trying to achieve in Copenhagen?
I think what the professor just said is completely right. It was the technology was more available for tackling the ozone than it is now about climate change. It's a very complex issue, and what the science is asking us to do is very demanding. So if you ask me if I'm optimistic about Copenhagen, I'm more optimistic than some weeks ago, but still, you will see a huge gap between what the countries will be able to deliver and what we need to do to stabilize the climate and to avoid global warming.
Okay, I'm going to drive Stéphane Dion crazy here by asking a political question, not of the only politician who is one of our guests tonight, but of the guy from Pollution Probe. So Quentin Chiodi, take this one on. The UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has urged the Canadian government to set more ambitious targets as we approach Copenhagen. In essence, he kind of called out publicly the government of Canada. Was that helpful?
Well, I would think it's helpful insofar as that when you look at what Canada is capable of doing, and if you look at our overall inventory of greenhouse gas emissions, especially downstream from the oil and gas sector, you know, we're often forget that if you were to shut down the oil sands tomorrow, Canada would still be well above its Kyoto commitments. So I think when you start looking at how we use energy in this country, for transportation, for electricity, for heating and cooling, we could easily adopt current technologies to reduce our emissions 40, 50, 60% than what we have now. Okay. So it is possible, but we don't have the right mechanisms in place in terms of certainty in pricing and other initiatives to make that happen.
Okay, but I guess clear what I'm getting at more is the head of the United Nations kind of publicly embarrassed this country into doing more. Is that the best way to actually achieve what he's trying to do?
Well, I mean, what he said is the truth, in the sense that Canada is one of the countries that is widely recognized as one of the laggards. Our target is not an ambitious target relative to what the science says that we need. And so Ban Ki-moon said that in public, and I think that needs to be said. I think we've done the analysis ourselves. We hired some economic modelers to look at, can Canada meet a more ambitious target than the one the government has set? We found it is absolutely possible, while increasing our GDP and creating nearly 2 million net new jobs. So I'm fully in agreement that Canada can be more ambitious. Okay,
I'm trying hard here not to have a partisan discussion tonight, and Monsieur Dion, you're here in your capacity as the former Environment Minister of the country, and not as a partisan, so to speak. But the Prime Minister did say, we get more progress with modest, useful steps, as opposed to these grand treaties, which at the end of the day may not get us to where we want to go. Is that a fair statement on his part?
Okay, I would try to avoid to be too partisan. I would say that the target is absolutely needed. Otherwise, politicians will always claim that they are doing something when they are doing nothing. But a target is not enough. You need to have a plan. And the difference between Mr. Obama and Mr. Harper, we may say both of them have a quite weak target, except Mr. Obama is investing 6 times more than Mr. Harper in his last budget, and 14 times more for renewable energy. So you have a plan in the United States and no plan in Canada. So I would encourage people to not look at only the target, but also the plan. And the problem with Canada today is that we have a very weak target and no plan to reach this weak target. Am I too partisan?
I don't know. Let me ask Peter Victor. The PM says modest, useful steps get us further than grand plans. Is he right about that?
Well, they obviously haven't got us very far up to now, and that's all we've had in this country, having turned our backs on Kyoto. So these modest steps have not delivered.
Well, having said that, you know, it was a Liberal government that put Kyoto in place and then didn't follow it.
Well, I'm not going to get into that.
Good idea. We don't want to go there tonight. All right.
But I will say one more thing, though, and that is that you're asking about whether a multinational agreement is going to get us there. I think the way I look at this is multinational agreement is not going to guarantee very much. But without an agreement, I think we're worse off, not better off. And so we definitely need the framework within which countries can then take action.
Here's how the Globe and Mail reported this just the other day. While the Canadian and American reduction targets are relatively similar, they write, which is to say equally modest, the Obama administration has committed enthusiastically to meeting those targets, and enabling legislation is already before Congress. The Conservative government, however, has revealed no implementation plan, preferring to wait and see what happens in Copenhagen and the U.S. Congress. In terms of a dedicated desire to move legislation, you see it in the United States. You do not see it in Canada, observed Graham Saul, Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. In terms of a genuine desire to make Copenhagen a success, you see it in the United States. You do not see it in Canada. Quentin, do you agree that the dedicated desire to move legislation is not here?
Oh, I would agree with that. But again, I think in the absence of there either being a positive outcome in Copenhagen is certainly no justification for Canada not to take action. And if the leadership isn't coming from the federal government, leadership has to come from somewhere else. And as we look around this country, again, once again, the leadership is really coming from a number of provinces. Whether or not it's Quebec or Ontario, they're taking much more aggressive actions, have more realistic plans in place to actually achieve those emission reductions that they've set as targets for themselves.
Mr. Dion, I'd be curious in your view as to which province you think, or which group of provinces is taking the lead in an area where you think the federal government is not. Stéphane Dion.
Yes. I think many premiers are doing admirable changes. I will mention also Premier Campbell, who put a price on greenhouse gas emissions through the fiscal system.
In British Columbia.
Yes, in British Columbia. The problem is that no country will be able to come with deep cuts if the central government, the national government, is not involved. And it must be involved in investments, in showing leadership, and in putting a price on carbon. As long as carbon emissions are free, it's very difficult to have deep reductions, if not impossible. And it's what Mr. Harper doesn't want to do. I'm sure he's hoping that in the Senate of the United States, Mr. Obama will be it will be impossible for him to go ahead. And then Mr. Harper will have the ability to say, I need to wait and wait and wait. Certainly he's not very committed to come with a real plan and to make the changes that the country would need to do.
Okay, in which case, we're about halfway through our discussion, and I want us to spend the remainder of our time considering whether there is, quote unquote, a better way. Peter Victor, to you first on this. Have environmentalists considered the notion that people, particularly in this country, just don't want to reduce emissions? They feel they can't. They are not prepared to make the economic or lifestyle sacrifices that would be required, and as a result, they're looking for another way to get to the finish line.
It's hard to really know what the people of this country think. I mean, I read opinion polls.
Well, their actions speak loudly, don't they?
Well, but you see, when you go back to actions, then this is the dilemma. You're always facing the question of, well, what is it? Is it worth my while acting in the right way when nobody else is? And that's what makes this problem such a difficult one to solve at the individual level, provincial, federal, all the way up. So just to say that, well, people aren't taking the action, therefore they must have decided there's some better way to go, I think is not the right interpretation. First of all, what information do we have about the alternatives? That's number one. I'm not sure people are particularly well informed. Number two, there are some even more deeper issues in play here when we talk about climate change than just climate change. For example, whilst we will remain wedded to the pursuit of economic growth at all costs, then I don't think we'll ever solve the climate change problem.
You think that's where we're at? Economic growth at all costs?
I think we're pretty much there. That has been taken as a given in this society and others like us really since the end of the Second World War, when governments adopted the pursuit of growth as a primary economic policy objective. And so what happens is that when something like climate change comes along, people, politicians, others say, well, can we address it without undermining economic growth? And I think that's putting things the wrong way around.
Well, there obviously is a swath of opinion out there that says reducing emissions isn't necessarily the way to go. Maybe technology will get us there. And to that end, I want to read something that was in the Financial Times earlier this month. Our key finding, say the authors, is that improvements in technology at historical rates provide little hope of meeting the broadly agreed global target for emissions to be 50% lower in 2050 than they were in 1990. Any prospect of meeting the aggregate global emissions target consistent with developing countries not sacrificing their energy needs will require revolutionary improvements in the technology. There is a low carbon path out of the climate change problem, or there is no path at all. The world needs to go on a war footing to bring about such technological changes. Claire Demers, I wonder, I mean, part of the opinion that's being expressed out there is that technology is not part of the solution, it is the solution. What do you say on that?
Well, I think that's absolutely, technology is critical to solving this problem. R&D, as that article mentions, is critical. But we need to think about what actually drives the deployment of technology. And there are estimates out there, for example, that we're going to need to invest $10 trillion over the next 20 years to move in the way that article suggests, on that warlike footing, that massive scale-up of new technologies. So doing that is going to require significant new investments. Companies aren't going to do that just because it's fun. They're going to do it because governments set policies and set the right frameworks to make that happen. So I believe technology is crucial. Policy drives technology. And I think that's been the missing piece up till now.
Stéphane Dion, can I get you on that? Is technology the solution as opposed to part of the solution?
Yes, but the question is how technology may reach the market. And technology reach the market when you're able to internalize the cost of doing nothing.
What does that mean?
That means that today greenhouse gas emissions are free in Canada. So the companies that are investing to decrease their emissions are penalized if you compare with the ones that are doing nothing. So in order to avoid that, you need to have a cost on greenhouse gas emissions through a cap and trade system or something like that. I tried to propose something to Canadians at the last election, and Mr. Harper claimed that it was a tax on everything. In fact, it was a way to cut your taxes on your income and to tax pollution instead. And at the very moment that you have a cost on something, it's easier to decrease it and to use the technology. Even today, some people, when they knew that I was coming with you, Steve, on TV, they phoned me and they said, I have a way to use ammonia to have a new fuel that will help to decrease emissions, say that on TV. But they don't have a market today because why to invest in these new technologies if anyway greenhouse gas emissions are free?
Quentin, what would you say is the most, or give, off the top of your head, what's a promising technology that could help us achieve what we're trying to get here?
Well, again, I don't want to keep belaboring the point, but I think there's a lot of technologies already there at our disposal. And if you go back and if you look at, I think, was the National Roundtable and their analysis, looking at Canada's emission reduction targets by 2050, all the technologies are in place. I don't think you have to rely specifically on carbon capture and storage, for example.
Because that's not in place.
That's not in place, and in fact, if you look at the Roundtable's analysis, it's only a very small component of what our emission reductions would actually be. So if you're looking at existing technologies for hybrid vehicles, for wind power, for green power, I mean, they're all there. What we're lacking is a clear policy signal, or rather a price signal, a consistent price signal to attract the investment that's required.
And that requires what? A clear, consistent price signal requires?
Well, over a long period of time, and policies that are not going to change by political whim from one party to the next, or a party in power that's going to change from one year to the next.
Okay, Peter, you wanted to say?
I wanted to comment on two things about that quote. First of all, I don't particularly like this resort to war as the right metaphor for solving a problem which requires a lot of cooperation and everybody working together. I mean, with war, you have winners and losers. Justice doesn't play a big role. It just seems to me to be the wrong way to think about it.
What's a better metaphor?
Well, I quite like the idea of an orchestra. Everyone plays from the same score, all together. You make fine music, but there are other metaphors out there. The war one really disturbs me for those reasons I've given.
Who's the conductor of your orchestra?
Well, the one I heard most recently was the young conductor Dudamel from Venezuela, and I think he was talking about this. Anyway, and talking about, if you're thinking of who's going to conduct the orchestra on climate change,
yes.
Then we're back to what the best we can hope for at a multilateral meeting. But I wanted to say something about technology, because I think we can put too much faith in technology. First of all, if you look at the historical record, we have become more efficient in using energy, and we've become more efficient in terms of greenhouse gases. We produce less greenhouse gas now per dollar of output globally and also nationally than we have done in the past. The trouble is it's never enough. So we get more efficient, but with that increase in efficiency, we increase the scale of activities to such an amount that it overwhelms the gain in efficiency. And I think that's the danger in relying too much on technology. We also have to look at how do we lead our lives, what matters in our lives, how should we organize our economy. It's much more complicated than just let's wheel out the technology.
Sure. Monsieur Dion, you used an expression a few moments ago which I know people in the environmental movement use all the time, and I think there's an assumption that everybody knows what this is, but I suspect they don't. Carbon capture and storage. A, is that part of the solution? If it is, tell me how it would work.
You cap the emissions at the combustion level, and you change it in liquid. It's CO2 liquid, and you put that deep in the soil, and hoping that it will not come in the atmosphere after. So it's capped and stored.
Is it a proven technology?
There are different views about that. What I'm convinced, again, is if you don't put the industry in the obligation to make it working, it will never work. Why the industry would invest in it if there is no obligation, no regulation, nothing? If you do it, though, I'm sure that the technological problem that we see today, the huge costs that we see today, would change pretty soon. Put them in the obligation to do it, and they will invest massively in Alberta to find the solutions. It's what I would suggest, and it would be great for Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Okay, let me follow up on Peter's orchestra metaphor here. Here once again from the same authors of that Financial Times piece from earlier this month. What does, they write, a technological solution mean for international cooperation? Well, it requires abandoning or at least postponing the primacy accorded to emissions reduction targets, a primacy that has been at the heart of the problem in the current negotiations. The United States and other rich countries should drop their demand that developing countries commit to emissions cuts. They should affirm that people in developing countries have the same rights to energy-based services as those in rich ones, and then offer to help them obtain those at the lowest possible cost in the greenest possible way. Finally, the major emitters, developed and developing countries, should put public funds into green energy research, and they should focus on the tough challenge of an agreed global intellectual property regime for clean energy that balances the need to preserve incentives for technology creation while allowing rapid dissemination. Okay, Claire, what do you think of that prescription?
Well, I certainly would not support abandoning the focus on targets. I think everybody in this panel has said targets are key to moving governments, are key to driving action. But I completely agree with the need to improve the lives of people in poor countries, and that transferring financial support is going to be a key part of a successful deal in Copenhagen. In fact, a number of the developing countries have said no money, no deal. And there is an absolutely critical need to provide support from countries like ours that can afford it for things like poorer countries adapting to climate change, moving to cleaner technologies instead of some of the dirty paths that we've followed here. So, you know, I think we were talking about carbon taxes earlier, and I've heard it said that there already is a global carbon tax, and it's being paid by African farmers. And so I think that's absolutely those equity and justice issues that your first guest raised need to be part of our discussion as well.
Quentin Quixote, what do you say about that?
Well, the one thing I just wanted to pick up on one of Claire's comments was the adaptation issue. And I think the science is pretty sound, that we're really looking at a very short and shortening window of opportunity to address the mitigation issue. And so there's going to be fundamental equity issues regarding who's going to bear the brunt of the cost of climate change from an adaptation perspective. And that was certainly part of the Commonwealth discussions earlier this week, of which, again, Canada was taking somewhat of a lukewarm position towards.
Peter Victor?
Well, I like the emphasis on equity in that quote. I don't understand why they think it's easier to solve a climate change problem by switching to energy and away from focusing on the very thing that causes the problem, which is greenhouse gas emissions. But I would wonder, if I could ever speak to the authors, why wouldn't they take the same position on greenhouse gas emissions? In other words, that should be divided up equitably worldwide if they're prepared to say the same thing about energy. And there are proposals out there which say, you know, we should all, as people who live on this planet, have an equal access to the atmosphere for disposing of carbon. And that should be the ground rule from which you start an emissions trading system. That would really shake things up.
Stéphane Dion, how do you like that idea?
The 49 poorest countries in the world are emitting as much as the small Belgium. And these countries are the most affected by the consequences of climate change. You have 2 billion human beings today that don't have access to electricity. No electricity, imagine that. And they are burning wood, or they will have access to coal pretty soon. So coal is the worst way to have energy. It's repolluting, and also it's emitting more emissions, 2 times more than oil. So we need to work with these countries to avoid a situation where greenhouse gas emissions will be completely out of control. And we need to offer them the ability to have electricity and a decent life. All this requests global agreement between the countries, developing and developed countries, and we need to accept our responsibility toward that. Because otherwise, I don't know what kind of world we'll give to our children.
Well, let me follow up with you, Monsieur Dion, and it's a bit of a harsh follow-up, but you know, there may be people watching us who say, how am I doing on time? I got less than a minute. Okay, less than a minute left, last word. There may be people watching saying, you know, I like driving my big car, I like living in my monster home, I like cranking up the heat, and I like putting the air conditioning pretty high in the summertime. Why should I change my lifestyle just to protect some farmer in Malawi I will never ever meet or see? What's the answer to that?
I think most people would say I need to do something for my fellow human beings around the world. Most people have a big heart and want to do the right thing. And anyway, if they think that they will be isolated by the deep consequences, the very serious consequences of climate change, now they are dreaming. No, we need to realize that we are all in the same situation. And if every human being had the standard of living that you just described, you would need 5 planets to make it.
And we don't. Thank you very much to everybody for participating in tonight's discussion. In our Ottawa studios this evening, Stéphane Dion, the former Environment Minister and Liberal MP, Claire Demers, the Associate Director for Climate Change, the Pembina Institute in Ottawa. Here in our Toronto studios, Quentin Chiotti, that's him on the right side of the screen, the Senior Scientist and Director of Atmospheric Issues at Pollution Probe, Peter Victor, Economics Professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies, York University, Toronto. Thanks very much, everybody. Merci beaucoup.